Hey y'all. One thing that I think is unnecessary as a history teacher is a misunderstanding around the Three-Fifths Compromise. Whether it's intentional or not, is something that needs to be addressed. And as we talk about slavery and early United States and the Constitutional Convention and all that, just kind of keep in mind that within the United States there were essentially two different countries living under the same name as the nation. You have the North that, by the Constitutional Convention, northern states were already outright abolishing slavery or putting in place laws that limited the expansion of slavery and the gradual abolishment of slavery. While in the South, you had states like South Carolina, where I'm from, that were really holding on tight to chattel slavery. It had infected society, culture, government, the way of life, and slavery kind of spreads like a cancer. And so you have South Carolina and Georgia that are diehard enslavers, not willing to give an inch. And then you have Virginia, where slavery was looked at differently. So before we even get to the Three-Fifths Compromise, that's something that we need to make sure that we understand. There were two nations under the same name of the United States living together and trying to figure out how to solve this problem. Something I want to go back to is that up north, even prior to the Constitutional Convention, the effort to abolish slavery or gradual emancipation of the slaves that were up north was well underway, and that division between the North and the South was already becoming an issue and coming to a head between the two sides, even before the Constitutional Convention. With the writing of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, being a slave owner, did include in his first draft of the Declaration basically the sin of slavery. He accused King George III that it was his fault that slaves and slavery were in the colonies. But South Carolina and Georgia refused to sign the Declaration of Independence with that anti-slavery bend to it. So that was removed to try to keep the colonies unified, or the states unified, going into the war. During that time in Massachusetts, there was a woman, her name was Mum Bett, and she sued for her freedom. She was a house servant, a house slave. She sued for her freedom in Massachusetts, and she used the Massachusetts Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, spelling out natural rights of the individuals, and she used the phrase, "all men are born free and equal," from the Massachusetts Constitution as her legal argument to sue for her freedom, and she won, changing her name from Mum Bett to Elizabeth Freeman. So, to look at the chronological order of abolition up north, you have Vermont in 1777 abolishing slavery, and then following Vermont, you have in 1780 to 1784, you have Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, with Mum Bett or Elizabeth Freeman winning her case in 1781, and then you have other New England states of New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island abolishing slavery. Then some time passes after 1784, and you get New York in 1799 abolishing slavery, and then New Jersey in 1804. And then by 1817, all of the northern states had either fully abolished slavery or had legal plans for gradual emancipation of the slaves. So there's a definite difference in the North and the South in the approach towards slavery. Again, the United States was essentially two nations living under the same name. So one thing critics of the United States like to point out is that, or say, is that we are so behind other civilized nations, other democracies, other Western nations for abolishing slaves and getting rid of that horrible institution. And what they fail to understand is that, number one, like I've said, I believe that the United States was essentially two nations under one name. Totally different economies, cultures, societies. The North and the South were very different from each other in many ways. Then, when people are critical of the United States, they also forget the fact that our system of government does not allow for the national government just to make sweeping changes because, you know, they want to. It's not a tyranny. It's not a you know, there's no king or queen that can just say this is what I want. All right, so it's a democratic republic, and because of that, it makes things a lot more difficult to get accomplished, and that's intended. That's part of the system. All right, so let's compare other nations to the United States. So Great Britain finally abolished slavery in 1834. The United States had already begun that process in 1777. Mexico, 1837. France, 1848. The Netherlands, 1863. Portugal, 1869. And Spain in 1886. So a lot of these countries are essentially following what the United States was trying to accomplish from before victory in the American Revolution. They were playing catch up to the United States. Our system of government made it difficult to make it across the board, whereas every one of these nations did have a system of government where they could have done it a lot sooner if they really wanted to. All right, so let's finally focus on the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The big debate about slavery early on was over the legislative branch and representation in government. You have the Virginia Plan, which was based on population determines representation. So the more people you have living in your state, the more political power you have. The southern states, the slave states, liked this idea because they wanted to count their slaves as people now living in their state and no longer just as property with chattel slavery. And the northern states didn't want to play that game. They didn't want to allow the southern states to gain more political power through counting slaves as people are living in their state. All right, the southern plantation owners, they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. This is our property, but they're also people living in our state, so we get more political power. Because slavery is like a cancer. It wants to spread, and they wanted to spread their power and influence in slavery into new lands. All right, so the northern states like the New Jersey Plan, which was based off of equal representation. Well, Connecticut, a free state, they came up with the idea, the delegates came up with the Connecticut Compromise, all right, or the Great Compromise, where they blended the two to form our legislative branch of government. The Senate would have equal representation, New Jersey Plan. The House of Representatives would have population determines representation, Virginia Plan. So what exactly did the Three-Fifths Compromise do? Well, the two Connecticut delegates that came up with the compromise, James Wilson and Roger Sherman, they tried to solve the apportionment problem. And apportionment is representation based on population. Their plan was to count 5 slaves as 3 free men. It's that simple. 5 slaves equaled 3 free men for the purpose of taxation and representation. And by doing this, there is a compromise between the Deep South slave owners and the abolitionist North. Yes, there's a compromise. They each had to give up a little something so that they could determine representation in the House of Representatives. However, by doing this, they limited the power of the slave-owning South. At that point, the North became more politically powerful because of the larger population. Had they counted the slaves as a full person for person living in the southern states, it sounds reasonable, it sounds fair, but if they did that, it would have empowered the slave owners more than what they already had. They would have had more influence in federal government, in national politics, and they would have been able to control much more of the national agenda when it came to government. So the Three-Fifths Compromise does not, I repeat, does not say that a slave was 3/5 of a person. The Three-Fifths Compromise said that 5 slaves equaled 3 free people to be counted in the census for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives and taxation. All right, so that's it. The Three-Fifths Compromise established 5 slaves counted as 3 free people for the purposes of representation and taxation. The Three-Fifths Compromise also, by doing this, limited the political power of slave owners in the South as it pertains to national government. It is, if you want to make the argument, and I am, an anti-slavery compromise. It prohibited slave owners from expanding their power and created a situation where the northern states had more political power and representation, and that will of course spill over into the 1800s in the debate over slavery and the antebellum years exploding into the Civil War. Okay, so anybody that says that the Three-Fifths Compromise established that slaves were 3/5 of a person or subhuman or whatever, they are either being ignorant or maliciously deviant, and I don't understand why. Because if you look at the history of the United States, if you look at the history of the Constitutional Convention, it's completely opposite of what these people are saying out there. Okay? The United States began the abolition of slavery in 1777, before the American Revolution was ever won. And that abolition movement grew throughout the American Revolution and was put in place during the Constitutional Convention to limit the power of slave owners. Period. End of story. And if that hurts your feelings, go learn some history.